On a muggy Friday afternoon, August 13, 1971, unmarked Marine helicopters began dropping onto the manicured lawns of Camp David. 15 men stepped out into the humid Maryland air. They were not military generals or cabinet secretaries. They were central bankers, treasury officials, and political operators. Paul Volcker, a towering Treasury undersecretary, carried a thick briefing book that outlined an impossible choice. Treasury Secretary John Connally, a smooth-talking Texas politician, had already made up his mind, and President Richard Nixon simply wanted to secure his re-election. Over the next 48 hours, locked behind military-grade security, with no outside phones allowed, these 15 men would execute a financial coup d'etat. They were about to dismantle the entire economic operating system of the free world. 2 days later, Richard Nixon destroyed the global financial system in 15 minutes, and nobody voted for it. Not a single member of Congress was consulted. Not a single foreign ally was warned. The British ambassador was given a polite phone call exactly 1 hour before Nixon went on Sunday night television. The Japanese prime minister found out by watching the evening news. In a single stroke, thousands of treaties, trade agreements, and currency pegs were rendered meaningless. The money in your pocket fundamentally changed its nature, instantly shifting from a claim on physical metal to a floating abstraction backed by nothing but state violence and oil. To understand how 15 unelected men hijacked the global economy over a single weekend, you have to go back 27 years to a secluded hotel in New Hampshire, where the trap was first set. In July 1944, the Second World War was reaching its kinetic climax. While Allied forces pushed through the hedgerows of Normandy, 44 nations sent their top economic minds to the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods. They had one objective: prevent another Great Depression. The men at Bretton Woods believed the currency wars of the 1930s had caused the actual wars of the 1940s. They demanded absolute stability. The British delegation was led by John Maynard Keynes, the most famous economist alive, representing a dying empire. Keynes pitched a radical idea for a neutral global currency called the Bancor, designed to prevent any single nation from dominating global trade. The American delegation was led by a ruthless Treasury official named Harry Dexter White. Per financial historian Ben Stile, White deliberately marginalized Keynes from the moment he arrived. White had zero interest in British utopianism because he held all the physical leverage. Europe was burning in ashes, and the United States held nearly 80% of the world's monetary gold in vaults beneath Fort Knox in lower Manhattan. White dictated the absolute terms. The United States dollar would become the sun of the global financial solar system. Every other allied nation would peg their currency directly to the dollar. In return, the United States made a solemn, legally binding promise. The dollar would be pegged to physical gold at exactly $35 an ounce. If the Central Bank of France or Japan or Italy ever wanted to cash out, they could hand the United States Treasury 35 paper dollars and receive 1 ounce of physical gold in return. It was a brilliant, elegant system. It fueled the greatest economic expansion in human history. Factories hummed, suburbs exploded, global trade recovered from the ashes. But the Bretton Woods system contained a fatal structural flaw. A Belgian economist named Robert Triffin saw the trap before anyone else. In 1960, he walked into the United States Congress and laid out what became known as the Triffin Dilemma. Triffin pointed out a mathematical impossibility. For the global economy to grow, the world needed massive amounts of dollars to conduct daily international trade. To supply those dollars, the United States had to run massive deficits, constantly printing and exporting paper greenbacks overseas. But there was a catch. The more paper dollars the United States printed, the less those dollars were actually backed by the finite gold sitting inside Fort Knox. America was writing checks its gold reserves physically could not cash. Triffin told Congress that the system would eventually collapse on itself. Either America stopped printing dollars, which would choke the global economy into a deflationary depression, or America kept printing dollars until foreign nations panicked and demanded their physical gold, forcing a sovereign default. The men in Washington completely ignored him. They had a Cold War to win. Through the 1960s, Lyndon Johnson launched the massive Great Society social programs at home while simultaneously escalating the kinetic action in Vietnam. The military-industrial complex demanded endless capital. The printing presses ran hot. Billions of unbacked paper dollars flooded into Europe. Across the Atlantic, the French president, Charles de Gaulle, was watching the American money printer with deep, cynical suspicion. De Gaulle was a pragmatist. He understood that America was silently exporting its inflation to Europe. By printing unbacked dollars, the United States was effectively taxing the rest of the world to fund its military operations in Southeast Asia. De Gaulle decided to call the American bluff. In 1965, he announced that France would begin converting its massive dollar reserves into physical gold. He did not ask politely. The French government literally sent naval vessels across the Atlantic to collect physical gold bars from the New York Federal Reserve and ship them back to Paris. It was a massive financial hemorrhage. Other nations quietly followed suit. The underlying math was entirely brutal. By 1971, foreign central banks held over $40 billion in paper reserves. The United States only held $10 billion worth of gold. Global bank run was accelerating. If every nation demanded their gold at once, the United States Treasury would be instantly bankrupt. The breaking point arrived in the second week of August. The British ambassador requested a private meeting at the Treasury Department. He formally demanded that $3 billion of British holdings be immediately converted into gold. The Bank of England wanted out of the burning building. Nixon panicked. He ordered John Connally to quietly assemble a crisis team and get them to Camp David immediately. No press, no politicians, just 15 men tasked with defusing a global financial bomb over a weekend. When the helicopters landed on August 13, the mood inside the presidential retreat was grim. Paul Volcker presented the Treasury's baseline analysis. The United States could dramatically raise interest rates and slash government spending to defend the dollar, which would trigger a brutal domestic recession right before Nixon's re-election campaign. Or they could do the unthinkable. They could default on the Bretton Woods Agreement, sever the link between the dollar and gold entirely, and let the chips fall where they may. Connally was not an economist. He was a ruthless political operator. He looked at Volcker and told him that defending the gold standard was a political suicide pact. Connally wanted to float the dollar, devalue it against foreign currencies, and slap a 10% tariff on all imports to protect American factories. Arthur Burns, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, pushed back heavily against the politicians. Burns warned that severing the gold link would destroy global confidence, invite massive runaway inflation, and shatter the alliance structure the United States had spent 3 decades building. The debate raged through Friday night and into Saturday morning. But Connally had Nixon's ear. Connally argued that the world relied exclusively on the American military umbrella for physical security. The Europeans and the Japanese would complain, but they would ultimately fall in line because they had no other choice. It was Connally who famously told a room full of European finance ministers, "It is our currency, but it is your problem." By Saturday afternoon, the terminal decision was made. The United States was going to default on its global obligations. They spent Sunday frantically drafting the speech and figuring out the logistics of freezing wages and prices across the entire American economy for 90 days to prevent panic inflation. Nixon went on television on Sunday evening, interrupting the wildly popular television show Bonanza. He looked directly into the camera and announced that he was directing Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets. Temporarily was a deliberate political lie. The gold window was slammed shut forever. In exactly 15 minutes, Richard Nixon destroyed the global financial system, and nobody voted for it. When the global markets opened on Monday morning, the chaos was absolute. The Japanese stock market instantly crashed. The value of the dollar began wildly fluctuating against the mark, the franc, and the pound. Decades of perfectly stable exchange rates vanished overnight. Businesses that relied on importing raw goods suddenly had no idea what their money was actually worth. But the Nixon shock was just the first domino to fall in a much larger chain reaction. By removing the physical gold anchor, the 15 men at Camp David had birthed a system of purely fiat money, a global reserve currency backed by nothing but government decree and future debt. Without a physical constraint on the money supply, the United States government could print infinite dollars. Economist Michael Hudson argues that the abandonment of gold was not a defensive move, but an aggressive financial weapon used to force the world to finance American military expansion without limits. The domestic consequence was immediate and violently disruptive. Inflation ripped through the 1970s. The cost of basic food, housing, and energy exploded. The American working class watched their purchasing power silently evaporate year after year. But a fiat dollar presented a massive geopolitical problem. If the dollar was no longer backed by gold, why would anyone continue to hold it? Why wouldn't global trade shift back to a gold standard, or move entirely to the German mark? The Nixon administration desperately needed a new physical anchor. They found it buried in the sands of the Middle East. In 1974, newly appointed Treasury Secretary William Simon flew out to Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. He brokered a secret, highly classified deal with the Saudi royal family. The terms were simple but completely world-changing. The United States would provide absolute military protection, advanced hardware, and kinetic intelligence to the House of Saud. In exchange, Saudi Arabia agreed to price all of its massive oil exports exclusively in United States dollars, and they agreed to take those billions of surplus dollars and invest them directly back into United States Treasury bonds. This was the birth of the petrodollar. It was a masterstroke of geopolitical engineering. Every nation on Earth needed petroleum to survive the industrial age. If they could only buy oil with dollars, then every central bank on Earth had to hold massive reserves of dollars, regardless of what the American printing press was actually doing. Gold was out, carbon was in. The petrodollar system created an artificial, permanent global demand for American fiat currency. It allowed the United States government to run massive, unprecedented financial deficits for the next 50 years without facing immediate domestic hyperinflation. But it came at a terrible hidden cost. It locked the global economy into a brutal cycle of boom and bust, driven entirely by the domestic monetary policy of a single nation. The true terminal outcomes of the Nixon Shock became highly visible at the end of the decade. By 1979, American inflation was running entirely out of control, hitting 14%. Paul Volcker, the exact same man who had been sitting in the room at Camp David, was now the chairman of the Federal Reserve. Volcker realized the fiat system was on the verge of total psychological collapse. To save the dollar, Volcker engineered a deliberate, massive interest rate shock. He hiked the federal funds rate all the way to 20%. Domestic mortgage rates hit 18%. It was financial chemotherapy. The Volcker shock broke the back of American inflation, but it completely devastated the working class. Factories shuttered. Farmers went completely bankrupt. But the real collateral damage was hidden overseas. Throughout the 1970s, developing nations across Latin America and Africa had borrowed billions of dollars, all denominated in United States currency. When Volcker suddenly spiked interest rates, the cost of servicing those international debts skyrocketed overnight. Entire sovereign nations went completely bankrupt. Mexico defaulted in 1982, triggering the catastrophic Latin American debt crisis. Decades of slow economic progress were wiped out in a matter of months. Millions of vulnerable people faced terminal outcomes as basic healthcare systems, food subsidies, and water infrastructure collapsed under the crushing weight of unpayable dollar debts. The internal domestic decisions of an unelected central banker sitting in Washington dictated the physical survival of farmers in Brazil and factory workers in Mexico. This is the stark reality of the post-1971 world. The original Bretton Woods system, for all its admitted flaws in American dominance, was heavily negotiated by 44 sovereign nations over weeks of intense, bitter diplomatic struggle. It was a formal treaty ratified by elected governments. The system that replaced it, the floating fiat standard that governs absolutely every financial transaction you make today, was decided by 15 men hiding in a Maryland forest over a single panicked weekend. They did not hold a public debate. They did not run on a democratic platform of ending the gold standard. They reacted to a crisis of their own deliberate making by quietly pulling the rug out from under the global working class. Today, I live entirely inside the wreckage of that weekend. We live in a world of endless financialization, where Wall Street produces absolutely nothing physical, but extracts massive wealth through currency manipulation and complex debt packaging. We live in a world where a physical house is no longer just a place to live, but an abstracted asset class used by hedge funds to hedge against the constant, deliberate devaluation of fiat money. We live in a world where the purchasing power of median wages has completely detached from actual worker productivity, a stark divergence that began precisely on the charts in August 1971. The wild financial instability, the rolling regional banking crises, the massive global wealth inequality, and the modern weaponization of the dollar network are not accidental bugs in the software. They are the actual operating system. They are the direct mechanical result of removing the only physical constraint on money creation. Some mainstream historians vigorously argue the Nixon shock was highly inevitable, a necessary modernization of an archaic, rigid system that simply could not support the fluid speed of a globalized economy. They claim Triffin was entirely right, and maintaining a strict gold standard would have suffocated modern technological growth. But the countercase is permanently written in the raw inflation statistics, the completely gutted industrial Rust Belt towns, and the sovereign debt crises of the Global South. A financial system designed by political operatives trying to survive an election cycle is a system perfectly optimized for short-term political survival, not long-term human flourishing. You have to ask yourself, if 15 men in a locked room could quietly delete the entire financial operating system of the world in a single weekend, what exactly is stopping them from doing it again when this current debt cycle inevitably collapses? Who really governs a global financial system that no democratic government ever voted to create? Let me know your honest thoughts on the legacy of the Nixon shock down in the comments. And if you want to understand exactly how the new digital surveillance state is currently preparing for the next inevitable financial reset, hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss